Good morning, everybody. The purpose of this video is to finish up our look at topic 5.8 with military conflict in the Civil War. This is going to pick up with the turning point of the war in 1863, take us through the conclusion of the war in April 1865, and then a little bit of an overall look at the impact the war is going to have on several different facets of the United States. By the time you get to 1863, the purpose of the war has changed. The purpose of the war has become, it has become a war for emancipation, as Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation has gone into effect. It is also a war that has gone much better for the Union in the Western theater of the war than it had over in the East. But when you start looking at the actual turning point where things are going to go in the Union's direction all the way through, July 1863 is the place to look, and this is going to take us first and foremost to the Battle of Gettysburg. So on the map here, you can kind of see, let's get our bearings straight. You've got Virginia and West Virginia. So this is Confederate territory through here. And then to the north of this line, there's Washington, D.C. This is the state of Maryland. And so this is Union territory. In late June, early July 1863, Robert E. Lee's forces leave from Confederate Virginia, and they pushed their way through the new state of West Virginia, through Maryland, and up into Pennsylvania. And the thought here was if they could get far enough north, they could cut due east, make their way to the Chesapeake Bay, and cut off supply lines, and hopefully try to cut Washington, D.C. off from the rest of the Union, therefore bringing this war to a conclusion. At Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, over a 3-day battle, this is where, this is the largest battle of the war. This isn't just the largest battle of the war, it's the largest single battle ever fought in the entire Western Hemisphere ever. The number of deaths on both sides combined in the Battle of Gettysburg is in the neighborhood of, it's over 6,000 men die over this 3-day stretch. This is it's a huge loss of life on both sides, but when it comes down to military strategy, well, you can kind of get a sense here that Confederate forces are going to be forced to retreat, and as they retreat, they will never again try to push anything further to the north. This is going to become a turning point because prior to Gettysburg, there was always the prospect that the Confederates could push north and could capture the Washington, D.C., the Union capital. But after this, it doesn't ever happen again. So this is the point where it begins to look like in the coming months that it's just a matter of time until the Union is going to be victorious in this. This is why a few months later, Lincoln gives his speech that's called the Gettysburg Address. The real purpose of the speech, like the literal purpose of it, was they were there to dedicate the battlefield cemetery, dedicating where 6,000 men had died. And this is where Lincoln is making, very clear his ideas and his idealism that this is not just a war to preserve the Union, to reunify the country, but this is a country that's based on democratic principles. And so he is portraying the struggle against slavery as the fulfillment of those democratic ideals and those democratic principles. And this is going to change the demeanor of the war in the East kind of forever until the war concludes almost a year and a half, 2 years later. Coincidentally, at the same point in time in the Western theater of war, the turning point there happens at the same time. So this is at the Battle of Vicksburg. If you have watched previous versions of these notes, you know that by 1862, the Union Navy has captured New Orleans, and they've been working their way up the Mississippi River here. And you might remember that General Grant has, successful at the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862, and he has pushed his way over towards Memphis on the Mississippi River and has been working his way down. So the siege at Vicksburg and around Vicksburg has been going on for weeks moving into this, but by July 4th, Confederate forces here have surrendered. And so within a few days at the beginning of July, you not only have a victory and a success for Union forces in the east at Gettysburg, but now you have a similar level of success at Vicksburg on the Mississippi River. The reason this is a big deal is that this is going to allow General Grant to leave the Western Theater and make his way east to go give his leadership to the Union Army that is in Virginia. And this is going to be like a marked improvement in Union leadership in the East. We haven't talked about it much, but in the Eastern theater of the war, Union military leadership has been kind of a revolving door, a rotation of people that have gone in and out with not much success, and that's going to change with Grant. Part of the reason that changes with Grant is going to be he is aware of the losses that might have to be suffered in order to fully achieve the victory that they want. But this is going to help the Union achieve the victory that they want. So when we get to the final phase of the war, the next step of this process is going to be General William Tecumseh Sherman and his march to the sea. So getting your bearings straight again, look, here's Nashville, and this is eastern Tennessee. Sherman is going to leave with his troops in 1863 and get to Chattanooga, and then finally through 1863 through the first half of 1864, making their way closer and closer to Atlanta. Sherman's capture of Atlanta is huge, but probably an even bigger deal on this is the level of destruction that's happening to Southern infrastructure along the way. There are not a lot of Southern railroad lines across the Confederate States, but when Sherman's men march through, and Sherman's men include thousands uh, of emancipated African American freedmen that join in. As they march through, they are destroying infrastructure, burning cotton in the fields, dismantling railroad lines, not just taking railroad lines apart, but taking the steel rails and wrapping them around trees, like turning them into donuts or into S's so they are not going to be usable anytime soon. Like Grant, Sherman understands that in order to win this war in a timely fashion, it's going to take a huge amount of destruction to get there. Through September 1864 until to the end of the year, Sherman is going to push all the way to the sea at Savannah, Georgia, and at that point it's going to turn to the north as you get into the beginning of 1865. It's Sherman's successes here that are going to have a huge impact on Lincoln's reelection campaign in 1864. More on that in the next slide, actually. But by the time you get out of 1864 and into 1865, Sherman's men are pushing to the north. Then up here in Virginia, Grant has become what is basically a war of attrition. A war of attrition means it is all about who is going to be able to last the longest. And this is the point where the greater amount of Union resources is going to become huge. As you look at this map on the closing Virginia campaign, you can see Grant and Lee's men, they come into conflict not just here at the Wilderness, but again at Spotsylvania, and again at North Anna, and again at Cold Harbor, and again at Petersburg. Previously in the Eastern Theater, the Union Army would run into a battle and then they would retreat back to Washington, but Grant kind of maintains this dogged persistence all the way through until you get to Petersburg, and then you get the siege at Richmond. Richmond is the Confederate capital, and starting at the beginning of 1865, really by the fall of 1864, Richmond is surrounded and is going to be laid to siege for months and months. In the meantime, General Lee's men are going to keep retreating further and further to the west until ultimately on April 9th, 1865, Lee's men surrender to Grant's army, thus ending the bulk of the fighting in the Civil War. There is still fighting that's going to go on in other parts of the country, but historians really kind of mark this as being the end of the war itself, because from this point on, the Confederate government has kind of fallen apart, and the bulk of the Confederate forces that were in Virginia have surrendered, and so there's not any more fighting that goes on here, where everything is kind of been coming to a peak. This marks that Union victory, and it is only 5 days later that you get to the Lincoln assassination, killed by John Wilkes Booth, as part of a larger conspiracy in this. Uh, when Booth kills Lincoln, Booth is part of a conspiracy that is really designed to um, not just assassinate Lincoln, but to assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. It's just the Lincoln assassin, John Wilkes Booth. He's the only one that's able to fulfill their obligation. The train here in this picture, this is Lincoln's funeral train as it embarks on a tour across the country, across the Union states at the very least. The irony in this is that it is in the days immediately following the peace that maybe the greatest loss of the entire war comes in, because Lincoln is not just serving as the president of the country. He is the president of the country that is looking to reconstruct itself and to reunite itself. And Lincoln has already begun plans to make reconstruction happen, but with his assassination, with his death in 1865, at the hands of a Confederate conspiracy, at least Confederate sympathizers, this is really going to draw the future of the country into even more question than it already was. So finally, looking at the other impacts that the war is going to see, it is worth it for a minute or two to talk about the politics of the war, because Lincoln and the Republican Party, they really only represented the Union, but it's not like the northern part of the Democratic Party really went away. The Northern Democrats had split into various factions. There were war Democrats that were favoring the war against the Confederates because they saw the Confederacy as a band of traitors, similar to how the Union kind of felt it, like we've talked about in class, a war to preserve the Union. There were other members of the Democratic Party that were called peace Democrats. These Democrats wanted to see the war stop altogether and wanted to see just an agreement that secession was legal and to let them go. And then a faction of the Peace Democrats are called Copperheads. The Copperheads are individuals that are taking organized action against the federal government, what we would call subversive or terroristic activities. There are conspiracies. The Lincoln assassination conspiracy could be considered one of these, but this is going to be a real threat the entire course of the war. And so when you get to the 1864 election, it really is a question of is this going to be a war for the country, or is it going to be a war to for practicality purposes? And this is kind of where you see this divide that shows up. For the Democrats, they nominate George McClellan. He is a Union general. He has been a leader of the Union forces in Virginia off and on for the first 3 years of the war. But it's not really clear that he's dedicated as a war Democrat on this. He is talking about peace in this fighting, that there needs to be an end to the conflict altogether. The Republican Party kind of merges with other groups in 1864 into what's called the Union Party, where Lincoln is still he's going to be the nominee, but in an effort to try to show some level of reconciliation, he chooses a Southern Democrat, Andrew Johnson, to be his running mate. Andrew Johnson's from Tennessee. Tennessee seceded in 1861 after Fort Sumter, but Andrew Johnson didn't agree with secession. Andrew Johnson stays in. He stays in the U.S. Senate even after Tennessee had left, and so he seems like a very conciliatory candidate. This is another one of those cases where maybe it is one of those great ironies that your vice presidential candidate may be added on as a way to attract voters, but not really taking into account what could happen if he is actually the decision maker. In this election, the course of the war impacted things. Like I said on the previous slide, General Sherman's march really impacts the course of this. But when it comes down to actually, tallying votes it's really the absentee ballots of Union soldiers. When those are returned home, when the ballots are returned home and counted, they overwhelmingly voted for Lincoln, demonstrating that there is a sense within the Union Army that this was in fact a war for democracy, and this was in fact a war to preserve the Union, and it was a war to end slavery. But once Lincoln is assassinated in April 1865, the aftermath of this is going to become something completely different. And when you take a step back and you look at the aftermath on this, the war is completely game changing for everything that has happened in the first half of American history. The Civil War is responsible for 2%. Let me say it again. The Civil War kills 2% of the American population, over 2%. There are somewhere between 650 and 750,000 Americans that die in this. That is 2% of the overall U.S. population. That would be the equivalent of 6.6 million people dying in a 4-year stretch today, based on population numbers. Of those people killed, 2/3 of them died from disease because medical care during the war was was not in a very good state. So you have a situation where you might not die from your wounds in the battlefield, but you are likely to die from the subsequent infections to those wounds. In terms of medical care, 75% of the surgeries that are conducted during the Civil War are amputations, which is going to lead to the development of the U.S. Sanitary Commission. There's a lot of medical technology and a lot of medical science that comes out of this. So I will stop short of saying that that is a silver lining on this, but it is a true statement that sometimes there is progress made out of disaster. And this is definitely a disaster for the nation. There is not an American anywhere in the country that did not feel the direct impact of the war through family member or friends dying as a consequence to it. So far as the purposes of the war are concerned, this is going to lead to the 13th Amendment and the abolition of slavery. And it's going to lead to a redefinition of what states' rights versus federal government powers are going to be. Secession is no longer legal in the United States, thanks to the actions taken by Congress through the Civil War. And the new sense of growth and stability that's going to come into the United States in the years to come means the United States is going to start looking overseas again towards some greater level of global presence. All of these things are going to be seen in the impact of the country as we move into the spring semester from the 19th into the 20th century. But there are still questions to be answered about how to put the country back together in the immediate aftermath of the war. And that is the last major topic that we will get into in Unit 5.